This is Jeffrey Jones, also known as Triple J, coming to you with the Community Podcast. What we say community is only common unity. That is the tie between you and I. The tie for all, the tie that binds us, the tie that makes us, the tie that makes us whole. Thank you for being here with us for this common unity. Welcome, guests, once again to the Common Unity Podcast. We are here for part 2 with Reverend J.L. Reeder, and he's really trying to help us out. I was so torn on some of the things that have happened lately between separation of church and state, and people just forgetting that's supposed to be a part of what we are. You go back to the Roe versus Wade decision being overturned. You look at the LGBTQ policies that are being put in place by the Supreme Court, Supreme Court's not supposed to make policy. That's for our Congress and our Senate. But it seems like more and more we're sneaking religion into how we shape policy, and that's not a good thing. But Reverend Reeder's here to help us out today. He's going to enlighten you to a few things, and he has some resources for you. So please welcome Reverend J.L. Reeder.
Thank you. Good to be back with you again today.
Thank you, sir. I know, looking at your website, there was a group that tried to come to Rochester and spread some of their doctrine, which is not very sound. But Rochester, to their credit, was not going to host that group. So they moved a little bit down the road to Batavia. And I if I remember correctly, you may have went to see what exactly they were saying. Is that quite what happened?
Yes, the Reawaken America tour is what it's called. Michael Flynn, who has worked closely with Trump for a long time. He's a retired general. He and some others have gotten together and have been putting this on for a couple of years, and they just travel all over the country doing this 2-day event. And when I attended the whole thing, I use Evernote on my phone, so that's how I took notes through this whole thing, and then I blogged on it about it for a few weeks afterward. What I come out of a conservative, evangelical, even Pentecostal background from a long time ago, probably. It's been a while, but I understand that religious culture. I've been there, been a part of it at times a long time ago. But I was just kind of blown away by the language that they used about other people. They don't just disagree with liberals or Democrats. They use language like the enemy, like demonic, like evil, pervert, and on and on and on. I mean, the language they used was just really unbelievable. It's not just, even when I was in that culture, and we talked a lot about spiritual warfare, it was spiritual. And we used language that you could find in the Bible, right? But the kind of language, the ideas that they espoused was just something far beyond anything that I had known before. And it was language of violence, even though, they weren't allowed to bring guns to the event, of course, but everybody talked about having guns, and the language that they used in and of itself was violence. They talked about killing people, doing away with people. On and on and on. And that's the kind of thing that we're facing. I'm reading a book right now by Jeff Sharlet, Sharlet. A long time ago, he wrote a book about the family. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but there's an organization based in Washington, D.C., started about 50 years ago. They are the ones that started the National Prayer Breakfast for Congress. And they're a secretive organization. They require loyalty, and they're out to rule the world. He wrote about this like probably almost 20 years ago now. And he's still out there. He's going to Trump rallies. That's what this book is about to a large extent. He extensive. He just talked with people. He didn't just go to the rallies, but talked with the people who were there, and the kinds of things that he includes in his book. He acknowledges when he's telling the story about what he's hearing from these people. He acknowledges like that this is so far beyond what most of us have experienced that at first he didn't want to believe it. He thought, these people they must not believe this themselves. But he found out they do. It's what a lot of us might have called people going off the deep end. But they're not crazy in a political sense. They just really believe all of this. So, I think both of those are examples of what's happening in this broader movement, this authoritarian movement, and what we can do about it. If we're going to speak up about the movement, sometimes all we can do is challenge the movement. We're not going to persuade people who have a whole different idea of reality than we do. We're not going to probably persuade them to change their minds, but we do need to publicly call it out. We need to say what it is and speak what we consider to be truth about what's going on in that movement. There is a power in that movement. I mean, the old saying about speaking truth to power still applies in a different kind of way, because there is a power in that movement to move people based on fear and anger. That's what the whole movement is about, has been from the very beginning 50 years ago. So they understand what makes people afraid and what makes them angry, and they stir that up, and then they offer them a way of defeating the enemy that keeps them from having what they want. That's what I experienced at the Reawaken America rally. It's what I'm reading in Jeff Sharlet's book. Something else.
So they not only hardwired the brain for hate, but they hardened the heart as well. This family that you're talking about, that Mr. Charlotte wrote about, I did a little research from the internet on that, and I noticed that it was males, and they were grooming these gentlemen for political positions and positions in high businesses where they would have control over the mechanisms of power in the country.
Right, exactly.
You're right. They truly believe that there should be an elite group in this country that dictates to everyone else how we're going to live.
Right.
So for us who believe in democracy and say that this is the greatest country in the world, it can be the greatest country in the world as long as we keep democracy alive. And it's such a fierce attack now that's going to be a difficult fight. And one of the things I wholeheartedly agree with you on is that there are some people, no matter what you say, you're not going to be able to convince them of things that are right and factual. They already have their minds made up, and that's the way they're going to go. So we have to speak truth to power. We have to stand together, and we have to stand away from those individuals who would enslave all of us.
Yes, and I think in speaking up publicly, I talk about challenging the movement. I'm not talking about standing there toe to toe and arguing with someone who is fanatically within the movement, because that's not going to get anybody anywhere. What I'm talking about is that there are a lot of other people who are kind of on the fringes a little bit, or they have one foot in and one foot out. And people who are in that position, I think if we understand the movement, if we understand the story, the narrative that they're telling and where that's coming from and what they're after, and then we can talk about those things with people who are not all the way into it, and help them understand, here's what's going on, and then if they want to, if they act like, if a person who's kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, you're trying to talk with, you challenge the movement but not the person, right? You don't argue with the person, and if the person only wants to argue, then you might as well end it nicely and go on. But sometimes just asking questions, I mentioned this before, I think, in the earlier segment, that sometimes as we're trying to talk with somebody, instead of trying to give them facts or say that that's not true, if we just ask questions, why do you believe that? Why would you say it that way? Where did you learn that? Those kinds of questions. And maybe as we talk with them in that way and listen to what they're saying, maybe they'll begin to reflect on it more and realize, hey, I don't know about this after all. So that's a part of the kind of work that I'm trying to do, is help people learn how to speak up, whether it's challenging the movement or seeking to persuade the person.
I love that method of communications as a educator. A lot of educators use that method in the classroom. They'll
Right.
redirect without being confrontational. And by redirecting without being confrontational, um, first of all, you avoid a conflict. And secondly, it forces an individual to think. So a lot of times when we have to rethink things, we can't articulate them in the same process that we may have heard on Fox News or somewhere like that. Now we
Right.
got to think for ourselves. So
Right.
that's a great way to do it. You also were enlightening me to some of the resources that you use and some you created. Can you tell us about your website and those things that you're using?
Sure. My website is just my name, Jimmy Reeder, Reader, jimmyreeder.com. That's where my website is. And there are a lot of resources there, some interviews with people who have written books or who are working every day at trying to challenge the movement about all of this. If you go there, then you'll find books listed. One that I read early on is called The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It's by a woman named Catherine Stewart. I've come to know her. We invited her to do a webinar for folks here in Rochester, and then she came in person to speak, and I got to know her over time. She's the research that she's a journalist, and the research that she did was just quite extensive, and she really understands what religious, and in this country, Christian nationalism is all about. Another book that I read is called Jesus and John Wayne by a woman named Kristen Kobes-Dumez, Kobesdumez. And she's actually a historian in a Christian college in Michigan. In the research that she did as an historian, and in her book, she writes about the authoritarian aspect of all of this, the John Wayne, independent macho kind of context that she finds within the church, and it's been growing within churches for quite a long time now. I mean, she traces it back a good 30 to 40 years, but the beginnings of it long before that. And it's the authoritarian, the sense that somebody has to be in charge, and it probably needs to be a man, and probably better if it's a white man, right? I mean, that's really what's in that whole movement, and it's how things have. We just saw that a couple of weeks ago with the Southern Baptist Convention. How tens of thousands of I don't know how many there were, 12, 15,000 messengers to the convention. All enough of the majority of them voted that women can't get up front and teach men. Well, that's there it is in this whole movement, much more extreme than that.
Yeah, so I would hate to see women pushed back into second class citizens again. But it seems that's the way that we're rolling things now, and it has to stop. One thing you told me about yourself
Uh-huh.
and your wife, you're heavily into trying to help the community, and one of the things is you're running your own business,
Mhm.
uh, but it's not just a regular business. Tell me about your coffee business.
Yeah, separate from this work that we do, my wife and I, for a dozen years or so, have run a nonprofit business. The program is empowering women who are in recovery from addiction, trauma, and incarceration. If they have a background of addiction and incarceration, you can bet they have a lot of trauma there in the past. Um, so the program helps empower them by teaching them life practices that help them really take responsibility for their lives and learn what they need to do to become to stay to stay in recovery and and not to go back to jail or to prison. So, but it's a nonprofit business. It's a coffee business, both wholesale and retail. And so we employ 15 or so of the women in the program, give or take, to run 2 coffee shops, roast the coffee, distribute it to customers. And so that's a big part of what we do in our life. We're both ordained clergy, and even in our retirement years, we're still working together as co-pastors in temporary positions. So we bring all of that to the wider work that we do, and we read the news all day long on our phones, smart news app. We stay on top of things all the time, and we don't just read the liberal stuff. We read all of it. I read stuff from the Daily Caller and stuff from Fox News and Newsmax, and if I dare go way out there, I'll try to even listen a little bit to Tucker Carlson or somebody like that. But you have to listen to both sides. You have to be aware of everything that's happening in the world. Why, you mentioned earlier about at the beginning of this segment about religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Why are so many people now seemingly opposed to that? For most of us who grew up thinking that separation of church and state was a fundamental part of who we are in our country, why are so many other people now opposed to that? And so learning about that, reading the news, paying attention to what they're saying and what's behind what they're saying is so very important. Why are they authoritarian? Why are they driven by fear and anger? Why don't they look toward hope and love and justice and compassion? For me, I think that's what Jesus taught. I think that's what the best part of the scriptures teach. The prophets, the psalmist, and on and on. And it's all the way back into Exodus, where when Moses said to God, "Tell me who you are," God identified. The way God identified himself was to say, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and compassion. And that same phrase is repeated again and again in the Psalms and the prophets, and not exactly, but the same thing in Jesus' teachings and on into Paul, where he says that love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is, And so the way I read the Bible, I find compassion, justice, hope, all of these things. Other people don't. The same people read the same Bible. Other people read the same Bible, and they come out with an authoritarian God, a God of wrath, a God where justice means getting even, revenge, vengeance. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Well, people on the right, on the authoritarian right, you'll hear them quote that or something similar a lot, It's not up to me, but has already told us that this is the way it's supposed to be, you know. And I've been a pastor for 53 years, and in my very first year as a pastor, I remember people saying to me, the Bible says, or my Bible says, and I'm like, even back then, even when I was still learning, new to ministry, I'd say, I'm going to have to study, but I don't really think that's exactly what the Bible says. you know,
Right.
that's always been there. It's why why theology historically in the church has been so diverse, because we read the same thing and come out in a different space. But I think this is why these are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world and how the world should be or is in reality. And one's authoritarian and one's compassionate. One's about fear and anger, and the other is about hope and love. And when it comes to justice, some people see justice as making sure that people suffer because of what they did, and other people see justice as trying to have some equity and equality and that kind of justice for people who have always suffered. Two different ways of seeing the world, and we have to understand both if we're going to talk with people who have the other way.
You are totally correct. And there's a myriad of reasons I feel that people want to take that route and look at hate and division. What you said, though, is absolutely true. Taking the other way is much better. But you have leaders or supposed leaders out there who realize that it's much easier for them to rule through fear and hate and control people through fear and hate. So they put that out there. The other part of it is, our perspective is always going to help shape our perspective. So just like you say, our perspective is going to shape our perception. And just like you say, when one person reads something, they get it one way, another person reads the same thing and they get it another one. I've seen that in action many times with many different facets. So, that part you can't really lick. And that's where the communications should come in and override that. But you can't communicate when you're divided. You can't communicate when you hate each other. And I think those people who want to rule us, they realize that, and that's why they want to take it in that direction. It's much easier to divide and conquer than it is to be a true leader who cares for all the people and leads from the heart and the soul. It's much easier to go the other route.
I agree with that. I do think that beyond trying to talk with people, listen and communicate, I think more people do need to take action. They need to get together with other people who see things the same way and are trying to accomplish something. So if people go to my website, one thing they'll find are a few interviews with people who are running organizations nationally, like Faithful America, for instance. I have interviews there with the people who have the organizations, and then I have links and a lot of information about those organizations, what they're trying to do, and how people can join those same efforts with those other organizations. One reason why that's important is that one of those organizations is called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. It's led by a man named Mikey Weinstein. He's Jewish. He's a third or fourth generation career military, I think mostly Air Force in their family. He was a lawyer, a military lawyer, and served in the Reagan cabinet. He was always a Republican. He has basically a conservative, well, at least the old style conservative Republican way of seeing the world. But he 12, 14 years ago, he realized that there was a growing movement within the military of people from this emerging evangelical religious right that's now authoritarian and against separation of church and state. They don't want that. They think we should all be crusaders, and they actually even use that kind of language, right? Well, so he's been working at this a long time, and just last week, I think it was, someone in the House of Representatives attached an amendment to a law that's going to be voted on that names his organization, out of all the organizations in the country, names his organization, and the amendment that he's trying to get passed says that that organization can no longer, it'll be illegal for that organization to talk with anyone who's in the military and vice versa. Now, yeah, how could that happen? Mm-hmm. So, his organization is one among many. I don't know if you used to watch MASH, but Mike Farrell was an actor, one of the primary characters in the series. Mike Farrell's the actor, and he's been a longtime supporter of Mike and Weinstein, and serves on the board and has helped to fund the whole thing. There are a lot of people out there doing different kinds of things to try to offset this authoritarian movement, trying to challenge this attempt to undermine separation of church and state. And so if you go to my website, anyone will find several organizations listed, the resources that they put out, and various webinars and interviews and on and on. So I encourage people to really find out who's out there doing the work and maybe hook up with one or two of them.
I agree with you totally. And it's just going back to what you said earlier about absorbing information from many different sources, whether it's a source you believe in or not. The more you can do that, the more you can analyze and understand what the issues are. But those individuals who like to just stick with their news source that's going to support what they want to hear become biased in their approach. And I don't think that's good at all. I think you need to digest as much information from as many different sources as you can in order to put that to work. And the more you can do that, the more you'll understand what's truly going on. And that gives you the ability to then participate, as you stated, with others and trying to fix some of these problems. But if you're not willing to do that, then you only bring biases to the table, and that's not good.
Yeah, and just one other thought too about all of this. I fully understand not everybody's going to spend the amount of time that I spend reading everything, reading all the books and on and on. But I do recommend one book, especially How the South Won the Civil War. How the South Won the Civil War. It's by a history professor, Heather Cox Richardson. It's listed on my website. And as an historian, she traces the history of this movement, at least the beginnings of it, all the way back to before the Civil War, and shows how what was going on before the Civil War in the South never went away. Just because slavery ended doesn't mean that what people who were in power then, the slave owners, all went away. The book shows how in the South, it just came back in a different form under Jim Crow laws and so forth. But how it really was a movement that moved west as the country grew and expanded to the west. That idea that there are some people who ought to be in charge. There are some people, because they're rich and because they're white and they're male, ought to be the ones who make the laws. And because they're Christian, supposedly, that's their religion. And their particular way of seeing that religion, that's what should, those are the people who should write the laws. Well, that's where we are again, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about right now. This same kind of religious right that believes in authoritarian rule, especially by men and probably especially by white men. And and presumably coming out of their faith as Christians, but it's a very limited, narrow, and I think ultimately wrong interpretation of a faith that many of us share. And so, reading a book like that, you learn the history of it and where it came from and why it's so powerful still today. And it's only increasing in power. It's not
Yeah.
it's not going away. Every day I read another article where people, even who are traditional conservatives, are saying that they think it's very possible that Donald Trump will be the GOP nominee again. And some of them even go so far as to say that, to sketch out a scenario by which he might become president again. Now, the people who say that are people who don't want it to happen, even though they're traditional conservatives. It's not going away. The power is still there, based on fear and anger, conspiracies, the telling of a story that many of us don't recognize as true, but other people believe it with all their hearts that it is. And they identify their enemies, which include me, for instance. Sitting there in the Reawaken America tour for 2 days, I felt like someone who was in the enemy camp, or the enemy who has infiltrated their camp, because everything they described by way of the enemy was almost all of it applied to who I am and what I think. So anyway, I would encourage people to read as much as they can about these things, at least to watch some interviews and find some resources if they can't plow through whole books about it. Maybe watch a webinar or two that gives the background, and then find people a group that they can identify with and join in trying to oppose the movement, and then learning just how to listen and how to talk with people, whether to challenge the movement or persuade the people, and see if we can't bring about a change in where it's been headed for far too long.
The female historian you were just talking about, could you state her name and the title of the book again, please?
Sure. Her name is Heather Cox Richardson, and she actually puts out a daily column, letters to America or something, I think it's called. But her book is called How the South Won the Civil War, showing how that movement took root and spread west, and which is why so many Western states have been so conservative all this time, because that Southern movement moved west, that authoritarian, oligarchic, male-oriented movement moved west. Yeah.
It's extremely apropos to hear this, because I remember when I first moved to this area in central Georgia, most municipalities, the smaller ones in this area, are still pretty much the same in that respect. And what I mean by that is, in Columbus, there's basically 3 families that control what goes on in that city. And it's been that way for many, many years. So what you're saying is absolutely true. And people in the South, they know from seeing it firsthand in these towns and cities that, yeah, there are a couple families in every one of these places that basically controls what goes on. And it's been that way since the end of slavery and even before slavery. So, yeah, it's out there. And that's that authoritarian thing again. I tell you, yeah, we got a long way to go, but I think we can get there.
Well, I hope so. I could go on about this for a very long time, but I hope people, if they are in agreement with some of the things that I said, I hope they'll go to the website. There's all kinds of resources there. I am putting together some coaching resources, some podcast files that people can download, and specifically about how to talk, how to challenge, how to speak up, and what all that means. So that should be up, I think, at least by the end of July, I hope.
Outstanding. Well, we're about out of time here.
Mhm.
Reverend Reader, is there anything else you would like to say to the audience?
Hang in there.
Oh yeah, that will
You
do.
know, I don't know about you, but I just get tired of it sometimes.
We get tired, but we don't stop.
You
No,
can't, because the people in that movement they're not going to stop. They're
they're
going to
not
keep
going to stop.
on unless people like us can find a way to stand in their way and slow them down and change the course of this nation. Yep.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. So yes, we're going to keep it moving, and we're going to keep moving forward. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much for that advice. And people, believe me, if you go to Reverend Reader's website, you'll really like what you see there. It's well organized. The resources are easy to get a hold of. He writes the material, and he obtains material that is easy to understand. So I think it would be a benefit to many of you if you can get out there, get your hands on it. Um, and as we leave, I'd like to say once again, positive vibes only. Love you all. Please, thank you for coming and sitting and fellowshipping with us today. And I just want to say, I know that you could be anywhere else in the world doing anything you want to do, but you're spending this time with us. And I thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, audience. And
Thank you for having me.
thank you, Reverend Reader.
Oh.
Okay. Have a nice day, all. Positive vibes only.
Hello, everyone. This is Sandra Jones, co-founder of Community Podcasts. I'd like to say thank you to all our listeners and viewers. We're asking for positive vibes only. Thank you and have a great day.